Hi, I'm Michelle Singletary, personal finance columnist with the Washington Post. And with me today, I'm pleased to have Andrew Van Dam, who is a data journalist for the Post, a great colleague. And he heads, well, kind of heads, or the Department of Data, which he dives into a lot of information and just makes it so accessible. And I was in the office and I ran by his desk because I just love his column. And I said, Andrew, I am just really upset at the stereotypes involving government employees, that they are lazy and that it's actually an oxymoron to say federal worker because they don't actually work. And I don't think I don't think the data supports that. And since he is the head of the Post Department of Data, I asked him what kind of information could you find to dispute what I believe is a stereotype. And so I'm going to throw it to you, Andrew. So what did you think when I asked that, and what was the first thing you thought about in terms of proving or disproving that stereotype?
Well, first of all, I thought, oh, great, Michelle Singletary's here. I'm always so excited to see you in the office. I am incredibly lucky to work with the world's greatest personal finance columnist. But more specifically, I thought, um, well, geez, that is clearly something I can tackle with data. I try to go into these things with as open of a mind as possible, to not have any preconceived notions and just let the numbers lead me. I will say, though, that in my personal experience, federal employees have been incredibly hardworking. I have had federal employees help me with data at all hours of the day and night, respond within minutes, give incredibly detailed, incredibly nuanced, incredibly careful answers to my questions. So, yeah, I might have been a little skeptical of the general stereotype that holds them as lazy, but it's clearly a major thing in our culture today. It is kind of the operating principle, the animating force behind this Department of Government Efficiency, officially known as the U.S. DOGE service, that federal workers are taking it easy, the good way to trim the fat is to cut the bureaucracy, that kind of thing. And I thought, geez, we can definitely bring numbers to bear to this. And I got started running some.
So where did you start? Because I love that you gave that background, and that was one of the reasons why I asked you that question. I've been covering the impact of all these haphazard layoffs and emails, and really quite a lot of disrespect. And like you, I've had a lot of experience with federal workers, both in my job for the Post and personally. My husband worked for the federal government for about 30 years. My best friend just retired from the federal government. I go to a church where a great many of people are from the federal government, so I'm a little biased, and I know and see firsthand how hard they work. But you can't just go on your feelings with something like this. And so, where did you start to answer that question about the work ethic? Because that's what we're talking about of federal employees.
Right. So it's a little bit tricky because, you know, they're not going to let us put activity trackers on all the federal workers as if they were, dolphins or tortoises out in the wild or whatever. They aren't going to be producing a stack of widgets we can count or anything that simple. But what I thought we could start with is just by looking at how many hours people work. And for that, I used the American Community Survey, one of the greatest sources known to man. And in this case, because we looked at a decade of data, we had survey responses collected by federal workers, of course, but there's no bias there. They're very careful, very objective in their work. On something like 13 million American workers over the past decade, so a ton of data. And when you start with that data, you start asking the most basic question is just who works the longest hours? So I split it up by class of worker, which is, comparing federal, state, and local government to nonprofit workers, for profit, all the different groups, right? And when I looked at that, the first pass at the data found that federal workers actually work longer hours than anybody else in the entire workforce, an average of something like 43 hours a week, which is a ton. And I was
That's
surprised by
interesting
that.
because there's all this talk about private workers and they work harder, but I found that just fascinating that of all the workers, private and off nonprofit as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. And there is some asterisks to that. For example, we did include in this first pass, 43 hours, we included the armed services. Now, you may say that's logical because the Department of Government Efficiency is talking about going after the Department of Defense in some ways, often civilian workers or maybe uniformed services. I don't know. I'm not that kind of reporter. I work on the data. Um, but for the most part, when people are screaming about lazy bureaucrats, I don't think they're thinking of soldiers and sailors, Marines. If you do take those out, then it drops by a little bit because, boy, the uniformed services put in incredible hours for very low pay. When you take them out, it drops a little, but it's still higher, about 41 and a half hours per week. It's still higher than almost anyone else. The only exception is it's a little bit behind self-employed workers in incorporated companies. And that's a mouthful, but it basically means small business owners, CEOs. So, people who have their own money on the line, who are deeply invested in the company, the only uh, federal workers are just about as invested as those people. Like, it's incredible the dedication you see when you run the actual numbers here.
So that sort of proves the point that they are working. Now, there was a lot of other data that you pulled out that I found fascinating, and you looked at well, not low income, but lower wage federal workers. What did you find in that area?
Right, because one of the things is that you can't really compare apples to apples with the federal workforce because federal workers are more likely to have full-time jobs than almost anyone. And so to really compare apples to apples, what you need to do is see how much people work for the amount that they earn. So I split the economy into 12 different or 10 different groups of people from highest income to lowest income, and then looked how much people in each sector work compared to the people who earn the same amount. And especially on the lower end of the pay scale, the lowest earning federal workers work far more for their pay than workers in any other sector, tied or ahead of self-employed.
Wow.
And so the lowest paid federal workers, and those are often the youngest federal workers, those are often, unfortunately, the people who are targeted when probationary employees are laid off, who are targeted by hiring freezes. Those people are some of the best deals in the entire economy in terms of hours worked versus pay.
So let me get this straight. So the lowest paid federal workers, those who they're working the hardest, and in this sort of haphazard environment of getting rid of probationary people, they're a target. So they're harder working, or at least they work more hours, and yet they're in the front line of all these firings. Did that surprise you, that data?
Yeah, it shocked me and it alarmed me too. It does not seem to be a wise financial decision. These are the best deal in the entire economy, these lower paid federal workers. Why would you get rid of them?
Right. So, a lot of the discussion centers around the DMV area. Lots of concentration of workers, but and I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but many federal workers, the majority of federal workers don't work in our area, the DMV area, right? And so we're talking about people in Iowa and Nebraska. I mean, it just sort of is so interesting that the rhetoric centers around DC, but in fact, we're talking about regular people in middle America who are being attacked.
Regular, extremely hardworking people. And I didn't publish this in the story because, well, we only have a certain word count for these columns. But I did check the numbers on that. And it's not that a federal worker just is lazier in DC than anywhere else or something like that. Because I wonder if that could be someone's objection. No, we actually find, you work about the same hours relative to your pay no matter where you are in the country if you're working for the federal government. There's no like special laziness aura surrounding us here in DC and the suburbs.
Right. Did you find any information? So one of the things that people often say is, well, all these federal workers are sitting at home eating bonbons, watching television during the middle of the day. So there's remote work and there's telework, which is two different things, right? Did you find any data that talked about how hard they work or how many hours they work?
Oh man, fantastic question. And I did because the current population survey, that is the survey behind, say, the unemployment rate, now they're very important federal data, has been since COVID asking people whether they work from home, how many hours they work from home, that kind of thing. And so I was able to look at that, and I did find that yes, it is true that federal workers are among the most likely to work from home. Now, self-employed are perhaps more likely to work from home, but that's, I mean, of course, that makes sense. If you're self-employed, you may not have a business to work from, and especially if you're a startup, you know? And
No.
but federal workers are more likely to work from home than employees earning a similar amount in other places. But when I talked to experts, they said, first of all, a lot of these people are hybrid, which is true. A large proportion of these people are hybrid workers, and there is zero evidence out there that a hybrid worker is less productive than an in-office worker.
Can you say that again for the people who are not paying attention, who want to just malign these hardworking people? Say that again, Andrew.
Yes, according to Stanford University's Nicholas Bloom, who is like the world authority on remote work and its productivity, he has found no evidence, none, that hybrid workers are less productive. Now, I will say he has the evidence on full-time remote and productivity is a little bit more mixed. It depends on how your company implements it. If you do it poorly or something, he has found that yes, there can be a slight decrease in productivity. But productivity isn't the only part of the equation. You also, when you are working remote, you save a ton of money for yourself and your employer through, building overhead and commuting and all these other things. And when you take that into account, and obviously all of these cuts here, all of these attacks on bureaucrats are under the auspices of cost cutting, money savings. When you take those into account, well, it comes out in the wash or is a better deal than working hybrid or in the office because you save so much money on all of these other concerns.
Yeah. I hear from a lot of people, and I've worked from home, that they actually work longer. Now, they may not, or I should say harder, but longer as well. I mean, I know, if I had to commute, I'm not really going to start my day till like 9 or something between getting in the car and getting dressed and all that. But if I'm home, I'm right to work, at 6 or 7, where it might be 2 more hours before I actually can do some work, and then all the distractions at work. And I don't know if people take that into account when they say, you're just home, not with your feet kicked back, and I hear this all the time from people who work from home. I get up early, I work on, and if I have a break during the day, I'm working into the night to make up for those hours. And it sounds like the data does bear that out.
Definitely. And you and I both have, worked with federal workers who are answering our calls at all hours of the day. It's clearly not this classic 9 to 5 thing. I will say that this is probably a function of them being the most likely to be full-time workers,
Mhm.
but federal workers also start their days earlier. I didn't have space for this in the column, but they start their days earlier than any other group of workers in the economy.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Now, I did notice in the data that you looked at uh, higher paid federal workers, and you found a little bit of an anomaly in terms of how many hours they work, but you had an explanation for that. Can you talk about that? Those workers, who may be making six figures, federal government
Oh yeah.
workers. Can you talk a little bit about that pool of federal workers?
Yeah, so I wondered about that too, because remember how I said I broke the economy up into 10 different pay buckets and we saw that the lower paid federal workers were a great deal? Well, there was one group, the highest paid federal workers, that I wondered might actually argue a little bit for Doge's case that we do have some lazy bureaucrats there because the highest earning federal workers work fewer hours than the highest earning people in the private sector, in nonprofits, in state government, any other sector. And so I was like, wow, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe we do have to look out for lazy federal bureaucrats. But as you hinted, when I looked a little bit deeper at the numbers, what I found is that the federal workforce is just unusual. Like we all know that. Like the people who the mix of employees who work for the federal government is so different than the private sector. And so once you account for that mix of employees, once you're comparing uh doctor at Walter Reed to doctor at private hospital or nonprofit hospital. Once you're comparing mail carrier to deliver, private sector delivery, whatever. Once you're comparing like to like,
Hmm.
that gap vanishes entirely. And in a lot of cases, especially with registered nurses, the federal workers put in more money pound for pound than the private sector. But in most cases, it's just that the federal workers are often in sectors where, um, concentrated in sectors where everybody tends to work less hours at that pay level.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's nothing different about federal workers. They're just human beings, who are getting paid money to do often very difficult jobs, jobs that they could get private sector pay for as well. And workers are workers. They're extremely hardworking and often driven by a strong sense of mission.
Right. Now it's so interesting because when you wrote this column, and then I got some blowback because you mentioned me. It's
Oh
like,
no, sorry,
oh, that's all right
Michelle.
because I can handle it. I got some back, and I'm from Baltimore, so don't even play with me. You know, but it's like, well, people can just look at just because they work, certain many hours, doesn't mean that it's efficient work or they're actually doing work. So you could clock in at 8 and clock in at 5, and not necessarily really be hard working. But your data actually did get a little bit to that they are actually working in those longer hours that they're putting in, correct?
Right. And so there are two ways that I get to that. One is the idea that federal workers tend to have more days off, more vacation, more sick time. And when we run the numbers, we find that is not at all the case. In fact, federal workers are less likely to be missing from work on a given day than almost anybody else in the economy, way less likely than private sector workers. So it's not that they're just sitting back and burning that vacation time or whatever. But the other thing, and to me, this is really the smoking gun here, is that through that current population survey again, um, the government actually asks people the same questions a year apart. And so we can look at people who last year were in the federal government and this year are working for as a wage employee in the private sector, and we can compare how did that person's life change when they left the federal government. Well, we find that in the large majority of cases, people who switch from government to the private sector end up working fewer hours
Wow.
for higher pay. Now,
Wow.
that is not what you would expect if they were just
Wow.
leaning back and collecting government money.
Yeah, that's like the mic drop. Like,
Yeah.
boom. I wish I had a mic because that just, I mean, this data proves that on a whole, they work longer, they work harder, and even when they leave the federal government, we see that they worked harder when they were in a federal job. And that's that. I mean, I hope people will take this data for the proof that we need that this idea that they're just sitting around doing anything for our tax dollars is just not true. It is false. Now, I want to ask you this last question because of all the things that are going on. Do you think, and this is asking you about the future, so it's not all database at this point, but there's so much pressure on them now. I've been talking to almost, I wouldn't say, yeah, almost daily because I'm getting emails and talking to federal workers that the stress level for them is so high and the rhetoric so hard and unfair that it's hard for them to do their jobs now because every day they don't know if they're going to get some random insulting email or the person who sat next to them is going to be gone or they themselves might be gone. It's so hard to work under those conditions. Do you think that the numbers might change and reflect the stress level that they are experiencing under this regime?
Whoa, that is a great question. And um, it is one of the things about, the federal workforce is that it does, in some ways have lower turnover, but that obviously has not led to lower productivity. It's led to higher productivity. It's led to people like the federal workers that you and I work with every day knowing everything about this data set, being the most valuable resource on the planet. And so when that steadiness is under threat, when the long years of experience they've put in are under threat, then I imagine it can have a negative effect on productivity. I would be worried that the government is losing, some of their best and their brightest right now.
Oh, that's such a great point, actually. And I love what you just said because one would think that the job security they had before, because they don't have it now, that there would be sort of a sense of, well, I can just do anything because it's going to take them really forever to get rid of me. But that just is not true. And so even under all of this whole idea that they have a, job for life, unless they do something, crazy, they still put in a hard day's work.
Yes. And man, when I looked at age, when I looked at that kind of thing, you did not see any evidence of like out if you thought that was true, if you thought people were putting in 5 good years and taking it easy, you would
Right.
see the hours worked decrease with age as people who have been in the job longer work less, and you don't see any evidence of that at all. If anything, you see the opposite, that the more people work, the higher they get in the org chart, the more important they are to the government's function, the longer hours they put in.
Do you think, again, this is probably not just the data, but our feelings, you and me, that they have a different mission, right? And time when I talk to federal workers, they say, I went into this work because I wanted to serve the public. That I could have gotten a job in the private sector making more, and now we know working less hours. But this is a passion for them, right? This is a mission for them. And I think that's why I get so upset. Of course, I was married to one of them, so it's personal for me that they have been so maligned and treated as if it's okay to treat them the way they're doing. Even if you agree that the federal government needs to be leaner, what is happening to them based on your data, the Department of Data's pro at the Washington Post, is so unfair and so unjust and just inhumane.
Couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. Like people are taking less money in a lot of cases. Like the data shows that to work for the federal government.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. I don't have any, let me just put it another way. I was going to say, I hope this puts to rest this idea of the lazy federal worker. I'm not sure it will, but I hope that you guys read his column. If you're a federal worker, you already know this, but read it anyway so that you know that we know you work hard. It was a wonderful column using data and not just feelings to prove that the federal workforce are hardworking individuals. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Extremely well said. And again, thank you for giving me the idea for the column. I owe
It
you forever.
was a great column. It was a great column.